Welcome to the third part of my IDW retrospective. In today's episode, we're looking at Transformers Stormbringer. This 4-issue miniseries launched on Wednesday, July 19th, 2006, beginning its monthly rollout 2 weeks after the start of another 4-issue miniseries, Hearts of Steel #1, under the short-lived Transformers Evolution subline and subject of Part 2 of this retrospective. Whereas Hearts of Steel was, at the time, considered to be a one-off, separate from the larger IDW continuity, Stormbringer was always meant to be canon, deployed as a stopgap between the recently concluded Infiltration series and its sequel Escalation, which would be published in the fall of 2006. During the rollout of Infiltration, it became obvious that there was a, let's say, mixed response to how prominently the human cast of characters were featured in the story.
After reading issue #2, I have just one request. Please squish Verity. Just have Starscream pinch her head between two of his fingers and be done with it.
In a bid to encourage readers to stick with the series, IDW began running house ads for Stormbringer with the somewhat desperate-sounding tagline, "Nothing but robots on Cybertron." To be fair, I can see why. In retrospect, it's clear that there was a lot riding on maximizing the potential appeal of Stormbringer. With how quickly things can go belly up in the comics business, you have to make every shot count, and IDW was still in the early days of proving themselves to be worthy stewards of the license. And let's face it, Infiltration was not going to be to every G1 Transformers fan's taste. Product and fiction produced during the G1 era was varied enough to give fans a range of preferences and wants to be catered to. Infiltration was playing in the 1984-1985 sandbox, featuring some of the more popular characters and relying on the core concept from those early years where the Transformers bring their war to Earth. If Infiltration was homaging the 84-85 time period and its ideas, Stormbringer was looking towards 1986 and beyond, weaving in the cosmic space opera elements that were made an essential aspect of the franchise, thanks in large part to the 86 animated film. Stormbringer also employed a more colorful and obscure cast of characters from the latter years of the toy line, a time when some might say the brand was going off the rails. Now, I think back on that specific time with fondness, but there's no denying late G1 was a definite shift away from what came before. Although not as popular or recognizable as the 1984 and 1985 cast, these later characters are nonetheless just as beloved by many of us who grew up with them, and their inclusion in Stormbringer shows a genuine effort was put in to reach out to hardcore fans and to embrace the weird and wacky late-era G1 lore. Beyond trying to sway the opinions of readers who maybe had lukewarm or negative responses to Infiltration, Stormbringer might have also been a bid to capture the interest and support of undecided or unimpressed Dreamwave fans. I say this because the house ads also emphasized the creative partnership of Don Figueroa and Simon Furman, who had collaborated on the warmly received War Within series during the Dreamwave era. Although the two had already been collaborating on the 2006 Beast Wars series for IDW subtitled The Gathering, Stormbringer was undoubtedly the marquee event, with Figueroa and Furman reuniting to tell a G1 story set on Cybertron. Judging purely by the house ads at the time, it's hard for me to not view Stormbringer as IDW throwing down the gauntlet, an attempt at assuaging hesitations and demonstrating that they would be capable of hitting the same highs as Dreamwave. Which is not to say that Stormbringer was a simple retread of War Within. Far from it, in fact. War Within was intended to be an origin story of sorts, to give us a view of the early days of the war that had, by that point in time, not really been done before. Due to being set in the distant past, it was easy to treat War Within and the ongoing Dreamwave series as separate entities. Neither really depended on the other to tell a coherent story. By contrast, Stormbringer was set in the same present day as Infiltration and fed directly into the main continuity, adding quite a bit of lore to the universe while connecting to Infiltration in some interesting ways. Stormbringer provided the first look at the Transformers' homeworld of Cybertron in the IDW continuity, but with the surprising twist that the planet had long been abandoned after being rendered an uninhabitable radioactive wasteland racked with dangerous particle storms and now devoid of energon. Or it was devoid of energon, at least. The main thrust of the opening issue of Stormbringer is Jetfire and the Technobots detecting traces of an ultra-powerful energy source beneath the surface of Cybertron and risking a trip to their former homeworld in order to investigate. Once on planet, the Autobots are ambushed by a rogue group of Decepticons led by Bludgeon, who plans to use the captured Autobots as raw materials to continue work on an outlawed science experiment known as polydermal grafting, one facet of his ambitious plan to revive the apocalyptic entity known as Thunderwing. Through a series of flashbacks, it's revealed that Thunderwing was once a Decepticon scientist on Cybertron, concerned with the ecological toll the Autobot-Decepticon war was taking on the planet. He predicted that the end was inevitable, and the only way to survive would be riding out the calamity by using a process he devised called polydermal grafting, which would encase the subject in a suit of nigh-invincible armor, a kind of synthetic skin that would be bonded with the wearer's body and mind. With his findings spurned by scientists from each faction and his research decommissioned by Megatron, Thunderwing, in typical mad scientist/monster movie fashion, saw no way forward but to continue his experiments alone, using himself as a test subject. The polydermal grafting process consumed Thunderwing's conscious mind, turning him into an invincible, heavily armed, and highly destructive monster, driven completely by unending primal fury. The Autobots and Decepticons joined forces to stop Thunderwing, but the only thing capable of defeating the former Decepticon scientist was, ironically enough, the complete collapse of Cybertron's ecosystem, a fate that Thunderwing's deadly new form, with all its scientifically advanced weaponry, hastened. It's never explicitly stated precisely how this happened, but given that we know Cybertron's core is dead after the cataclysm, and Thunderwing appears to be capable of generating environmentally devastating attacks, combined with the images of the former Decepticon engulfed in flames, I think it's reasonable to assume that Thunderwing somehow burned out Cybertron's core and was deactivated in the process. With Cybertron's core dead and its atmosphere obliterated and unable to stop the planet from being bombarded with cosmic radiation, the Autobots and Decepticons have no choice but to abandon Cybertron, taking their war with them to distant planets. This complete and utter failure continues to haunt Optimus Prime into the present day, and the Autobot commander can't shake the feeling that the threat posed by Thunderwing has not passed. His dread is given shape when he receives a distress signal from the Technobot nose cone, sent moments before Bludgeon's devastating attack on Jetfire's team. Fearing the worst, Prime directs his crew to set a course for Cybertron and summons the Wreckers to join them immediately. Before the two teams arrive, however, Bludgeon manages to reactivate Thunderwing using Ore-13, and using a device called the Axis Cradle to control Thunderwing, directs the destructive entity off-world to the planet Nebulos. Bludgeon has formed an apocalyptic cult around Thunderwing, believing the mindless monster to be a weapon of purifying judgment. Convinced that they've refined Thunderwing's polydermal grafting research, Bludgeon and his followers plan to coat themselves in polydermal armor and use Thunderwing to purge every planet they come into contact with, starting with Nebulos. Now, this planet Nebulos is home to a technologically advanced society, currently in the early stages of being infiltrated by a small Decepticon unit led by Darkwing, plans which are promptly thrown into disarray as Thunderwing arrives and begins tearing the planet apart. Darkwing sends the information up the chain of command to Megatron, who instructs Razorclaw to oversee an operation to stop Thunderwing at all costs, even if it means destroying Cybertron itself. Meanwhile, Optimus Prime and the Wreckers have arrived on Cybertron, rescuing Jetfire and the Technobots with relative ease and finding Bludgeon inert after trapping himself inside a polydermal shell. I think it's safe to say that those refinements that Bludgeon made didn't really do much. The Autobots destroy the Axis Cradle, but rather than stopping Thunderwing, it activates a homing instinct, drawing him back to Cybertron for a final showdown, which I don't know why, but sure. The Autobots make their last stand, joined briefly by Razorclaw's Decepticons, before the reinforcements are recalled as Decepticon Command prepares to nuke the planet. Jetfire discovers a quirk with OR-13 where the user's energy levels can burn out with enough exertion. Hoping it's a weakness that can be exploited, the Autobots rally around Optimus Prime and a host of reprogrammed Centurion drones for a final push. The conflict eventually comes down to Optimus Prime against Thunderwing, with the Autobot commander throwing everything he has at the unstoppable force, refusing to back down and lose Cybertron a second time. Miraculously, Prime's last-ditch effort works. Thunderwing powers down and Razorclaw calls off the orbital strike at the very last second. The immediate threat is over, but there are still lingering dangers with OR-13. Later, Jetfire relays that Bludgeon had discovered a Decepticon project called Regenesis, which led him to OR-13 on Earth. Optimus connects this new information to an earlier report he received, telling him that the Decepticons on Earth had engaged siege mode unexpectedly and sets a course to the Blue Planet to rejoin Prowl's detachment. And that wraps up the story. I gotta say, Stormbringer, it's quite a humdinger of a comic. It's a great read, but there's also a fair amount of cool stuff to talk about with this one. So let's get into it. The first thing I want to go into, which I touched on earlier, is that Stormbringer interlocks with Infiltration in some ways that I think are pretty cool. It seems to me that the entire Stormbringer series is happening in tandem with events of issues 3 through 5 of Infiltration. There are 3 components that I see that link Stormbringer to those issues. The first one, from Stormbringer issue number 1, involves Optimus Prime receiving the transmission that Ironhide sent in Infiltration number 3. The second instance is in Stormbringer number 3 during a long-distance communication between Razorclaw and Megatron. As Verity is exploring the Decepticon bunker in Nebraska during Infiltration number 4, she stumbles into the tail end of this conversation, where we see only the ominous words from Megatron. Yes, especially Cybertron. Stormbringer number 3 completes this conversation, showing that Razorclaw was informing Megatron about Thunderwing's revival and attack on Nebulos. Megatron ordered Razorclaw to do whatever was necessary to stop Thunderwing, even if entire worlds had to burn, in his words. And when Razorclaw asks if that edict includes Cybertron, Megatron responds with the line we saw in Infiltration number 4, yes, especially Cybertron. And for the last connection, I think Furman intended to use the Cybertronian unit of time called a megacycle to link up the 2 books as well. And in case you don't know or have forgotten, a megacycle is a unit of time that's never detailed in any official capacity. The closest we got was a forum post made by Furman at the time, and well, I ranted about this during the Infiltration video, but I don't think the value he assigned works at all. I already went off on the megacycle thing in the Infiltration video, so I'm going to try to show some restraint for once in my life and just say that I think it's very silly that the battle with Thunderwing supposedly took 93 hours going by Furman's definition. That's way too much, right? Anyway, at the start of Infiltration number 6, right before Starscream emerges from a chamber after powering up on OR-13, Astrotrain says that he was in there for a whole megacycle. In Stormbringer number 4, Razorclaw sets the countdown for the orbital strike on Cybertron for 1 megacycle. That would mean that the final issue of Stormbringer occurs prior to Infiltration number 6, during issue number 5, and however much time elapses between issue number 5 and number 6. This seems to check out, as it means the battle with Thunderwing and Stormbringer would wrap up before Megatron and Starscream's confrontation would resolve in Infiltration number 6, giving Optimus Prime the time he would need, in comic book terms that ignore the laws of physics anyway, to leave Cybertron and arrive at Arc 19 in time for his appearance at the final page of Infiltration number 6. Speaking of Optimus Prime, Stormbringer features my favorite design for the character, apart from the classic G1 look. This Cybertronian design would become the go-to design for Orion Pax and Optimus Prime for flashback scenes throughout the IDW run. There was another Orion Pax design that appeared in Spotlight Blur, but, we'll talk about that another time. The Phase 2 version of this design will lean towards a more traditional blue coloration for the chest windows and eyes, which I have to say is kind of a bummer because I liked the orangey yellow used in Stormbringer. And the eyes being yellow suggests that Josh Burcham was drawing from the G1 toy for inspiration, but the chest windows go back to War Within. In fact, this whole design was adapted from Don Figueroa's previous Optimus Prime design for the Dreamwave series. Putting the two side by side, you can see he didn't just do a copy-paste here. He made a few refinements for sure, and for the better, in my opinion, which is saying something because it was a cool design to begin with, but I do think Figueroa made it even better in Stormbringer. And while we're on the subject of War Within designs, Springer's head is reminiscent of how Figueroa drew him for the cover of War Within, The Dark Ages #2, missing his characteristic fin at the center of his head for some reason, but that seems to be the only design element that was ported over from War Within. It appears that apart from the head, Figueroa gave Springer a full redesign for Stormbringer. Another design-based note, Jetfire's design for Stormbringer was based on his Classics toy from 2006, which featured a removable battle mask homaging the G1 toy. Like many small accessories from the toys I had as a kid, Jetfire's mask is set aside relatively quickly in Stormbringer #1 and presumably lost underneath the couch for the rest of the series. But not to worry, the battle mask will make a triumphant return in future Transformers issues. Now this is a really small detail, but Megatron's helmet being black during Stormbringer's flashback sequences is a nod to the way the character was colored during the Marvel Comics years, with a black helmet rather than the gray or silver helmet that has roots in both the G1 toy and the cartoon. I actually kind of prefer this coloration. It adds some nice breakup to the colors, I think, but that's just my opinion. Anyway, like the Stormbringer design for Optimus, Megatron's black helmet would be used occasionally for flashback sequences in Phase 2, with the exception, strangely enough, of the entire Autocracy trilogy. I guess it's reasonable to assume that Megatron's fashion sense just changed periodically during the war, and he went back and forth for a time. We also need to talk about the Matrix here. In issue #1, during the flashback, when Megatron is waking Prime, we see that Optimus has suffered some damage, leaving his chest slightly ajar, a bright light glowing from within. While not explicitly visible, it's not unreasonable to assume that this is the Matrix. And the funny thing about that is that Furman had no intention of having Optimus be in possession of the Matrix in the IDW continuity. So in those terms, this would be a coloring error. In a December 12, 2007 blog post Q&A, Furman shed some light on his plans for the Matrix, referencing Spotlight Galvatron, where it's revealed that Nova Prime once carried the Matrix, but the fate of the artifact was since unknown, and that, in his words, its return will not necessarily be a thing of celebration. Furman originally envisioned the Matrix as being lost for a very long time, and cryptically hinted that it had become something new in the intervening years. In the post, Furman said that the Matrix had a prominent part to play in future stories, and answers about its fate would be coming in 2008 after the Devastation series. Clearly, these plans were shelved for the changing of the guard from Furman to McCarthy for All Hail Megatron, where it was retconned that Optimus had the Matrix and had been carrying it for quite some time, as would eventually be detailed in Transformers Autocracy. So, the error in Stormbringer ended up not being an error at all, amusingly enough. Still, I'm very curious about how Furman's original plans would have played out. And I wonder if we got a hint of them in Revelation, where Nemesis Prime wielded a mystical energy source called the Darkness that he briefly passed to Optimus Prime. Was the Darkness originally supposed to be the Matrix in its new form, or was it going to be something else entirely? We may never know unless Simon someday spills the beans. Speaking of canceled plans, did you know Furman never intended to have Primus or Unicron be a part of the IDW continuity? He He emphatically said so in an IDW forum post also from December 2007, in answer to a question about the gods fitting into the new universe. In his response, he also hinted that the dead universe may be connected in some way to the origin of the Transformers instead of Primus, remarking that the dead universe wasn't always dead. Anyway, I bring this up because Primacron gets mentioned in Stormbringer the way you would expect the Transformers to traditionally refer to Primus. Primacron is an interesting choice to use instead, though, seeing as how he was just some goofball who showed up in Call of the Primitives, an episode from Season 3 of the G1 cartoon. And in that episode, it was revealed that Primacron was Unicron's creator, so good for him, I guess. The existence and/or significance of Primacron in the IDW continuity was never followed up on. Instead, he was quietly set aside, and Primus was retconned back into the Transformers creation myths after the conclusion of Furman's tenure on the series. Pretenders play a big part in Stormbringer, so we gotta talk about them. Thunderwing, Bludgeon, and Bludgeon's gang, consisting of Iguanus, Bombburst, Skullgrin, and Finback, are all characters from later on in the Generation 1 toy line from the Pretenders subgroup that debuted in 1988. The original Pretender gimmick featured basic and fairly generic-looking Transformers that would fit inside a barely articulated, non-transforming humanoid, beast, or monster shell because, well, I don't know. I'm sure that they had their reasons. Robots in disguise or whatever, I guess, right? Don't ask me how cosplaying as Samurai Skeletor is in any way, shape, or form a disguise, but that's the Pretender gimmick for you. Pretenders didn't appear in the US cartoon series, so for many of us, their appearances in Transformers fiction were limited to the Marvel comics, where Bludgeon and Thunderwing were, for a time, major antagonists. The roster of Pretenders wasn't entirely composed of all new characters either. In 1989, classic characters like Jazz, Bumblebee, and Grimlock all became Pretenders as well, and all were featured prominently in comic stories like Primal Scream and Matrix Quest during 1989 and 1990. Now, for Stormbringer, Furman obviously totally overhauls and modernizes Pretenders at the conceptual level. But the character designs are also reimagined by Figueroa to be a mix of the monster Pretender shells and the inner robots of the toys themselves. Kind of like the Legacy toys, but different. Same idea, different execution. Bludgeon and Thunderwing are kind of interesting cases here because they're the only two Decepticons to actually utilize Pretender armor, so there's a bit more to talk about with their redesigns. When Bludgeon suits up, he takes on an appearance that's very much inspired by his G1 design, but his inner robot design in Stormbringer seems to follow the mix of inner robot and Pretender shell of his compatriots, but with a neat little twist. Bludgeon's standard robot body is in various states of disrepair, giving him a skeletal appearance that I think is a clever nod to his original Pretender shell. His head is particularly noteworthy. Figueroa ditched the bland head and face of the G1 inner robot, choosing a design that's evocative of the much more striking head of his Pretender shell, but missing his lower jaw, leaving a mess of exposed wires in its place. Aside from looking rad as hell, this design choice always makes me think of Derek Yaniger's cover to Transformers Generation 2 issue number 5, which, spoiler alert, features the death of Bludgeon at G2 Megatron's hands, or tank cannon, rather. Compared to the others, Thunderwing gets a much more straightforward redesign in the pages of Stormbringer, with the look for his inner robot and Pretender shell lining up pretty faithfully to the original designs of the robot and the shell of the G1 toy, just with some new and modern touches. In 1989, Thunderwing was part of the Mega Pretender roster of Pretender toys. Mega Pretenders were more complex than the standard Pretenders, in that both the inner robot and Pretender shell could transform into vehicle modes, as well as combine into a single larger vehicle mode. And just like Mega Pretenders were a step above regular Pretenders, Ultra Pretenders were a step above Mega Pretenders, featuring the same gimmick of Mega Pretenders, only adding a second shell for the first shell to fit inside of. It's just shells and shells and shells in 1989. Anyway, I bring all this up because in Stormbringer issue number 4, Thunderwing activates what Jetfire calls a secondary Ultra mode, a superfluous but amusing nod to the ever-increasing absurdity of the history of the Pretender toys. Not only that, but Thunderwing's inclusion in Stormbringer seems to be a sly nod to the character's arc in the US Marvel comic. There, Thunderwing had an affinity to the creation matrix and pursued it with a single-mindedness that alienated and endangered the Decepticons under his command. After attaining the Matrix, Thunderwing became almost unstoppably powerful, but at the expense of his conscious mind, his will consumed and taken over by the creation matrix itself. While not exactly the same in terms of the finer details, it's hard not to see some similarities to his fate in Stormbringer, where his single-minded focus on his research turns him into a mindless engine of destruction. Beyond the Pretenders, there's a bevy of references that plant Stormbringer firmly in the wheelhouse of the late G1 era of Transformers. Whereas Infiltration focused on a handful of the greatest hits characters from 1984 through 1985, with a sprinkling of the 1986 Battle Chargers for good measure, Stormbringer is mostly drawing from the rosters of 1987 through 1989, although the series does throw in some of the more obscure and or less iconic offerings from 1985 through 1986 as well, such as Twin Twist, Topspin, Roadbuster, the Predacons, and so on. Aside from the blink and you miss it cameos by the likes of Blaster, Perceptor, and Thrust, the most popular characters in this book are Optimus Prime, Megatron, Springer, and Jetfire. And this small number of heavy hitters is surrounded by a legion of less remembered faces. Less remembered in varying degrees, of course. I know the Predacons are more popular than the Throttlebots, but you know what I mean. Neither of those teams are as popular as, say, the Constructicons or the Dinobots. And it's not just character selection. The planet of Nebulos makes an appearance as well, and in the Marvel comic and US cartoon, Nebulos was the planet where the binary bonding process was developed and implemented, leading to the Headmasters, Target Masters, and Power Masters, a spattering of which are seen in this book, sans Masters gimmicks, of course, including Point Blank, Scoop, Crosshairs, Darkwing, Dreadwind, Trigger Happy, Skullcruncher, and so on. Let's move on to the Wreckers. The Wreckers, an enduringly popular group of Autobots who have found their way into numerous Transformers continuities, make their IDW debut in Stormbringer. The Wreckers are an elite Autobot Special Forces unit who are often dispatched to take on the most dangerous and borderline suicidal missions available. The group was created by Simon Furman in the pages of the Marvel UK comic for the fan-favorite Target 2006 storyline. The team roster in the UK comics consisted of original creations Impactor and Rack and Ruin, characters that were exclusive to the UK comics at the time, with no presence in the original Transformers toy line. Impactor and Rack and Ruin were alongside characters that did exist in the toy line, such as the Jumpstarters, Topspin, and Twin Twist, Roadbuster, Whirl, and, eventually, the Autobot Triple Changers, Springer, Broadside, and Sandstorm. The Marvel UK lineup is essentially the same one utilized for the Wreckers' appearance in Stormbringer, with a couple of changes. The original characters, Impactor and Rack and Ruin, were completely left out, with no mention of whether or not they existed in this continuity. It turns out they did, but would not be brought in until after Furman's departure. Scoop, the Autobot double Target Master from the 1988 lineup of toys, was added to the roster of the Wreckers for Stormbringer. He may seem like a somewhat random addition at first, but his tech spec and universe entry bios pretty much scream Wrecker to me, describing him as a gung-ho fighter who never gives up, and that he is known as the most capable, reliable Autobot warrior in a ground skirmish, and the kind of soldier you would want nearby if you were pinned down by a Decepticon laser fire in a slag swamp and were running low on ammunition, among other lines of praise. So Scoop seems like an excellent candidate for the Wreckers, but more importantly, his inclusion shows that Simon Furman put some care and research into which pre-existing character would be a good fit for the team. Another thing of note is some more Phase 6 foreshadowing. In issue number 2, when we first see the Wreckers on Vera Centralis, Springer is having a call with Bluestreak. We can only hear Springer's end of the conversation, but he says, "No, I don't care if it's Phase 60, we don't cede this world to the Decepticons without one heck of a kick and struggle." Presumably, Bluestreak said something about it being Phase 6, prompting this response from Springer. This is more coy banter, similar to Ratchet's "You Don't Want to Know" line from Infiltration, suggesting the deadly importance of Phase 6 in the infiltration protocol. Obviously, in hindsight, we know more about Phase 6 and what it entails, but at the time, it seems obvious that Furman was building up to something with Phase 6. And he was, but here we get our first glimpse of what Phase 6 might actually entail, as we see the conflict unfold on Varys Centralis in the form of outright warfare and complete devastation. And just for fun, we got to talk about Cybertron's moons. Towards the end of issue 4, when the Autobots are confirming that Thunderwing is down for the count, you can see 2 moons. Now, there's no reason why there shouldn't be 2 moons at this point in the continuity, but I suppose it could be considered a goof of a sort. Phase 2 established Luna 1 as having mysteriously vanished long ago, being lost to time. So, with that in mind, the moon really shouldn't be here. But of course, this creative team never planned for that plot point, which was picked up by later creators, so there you go. Oh, the joys of ongoing comics and their convoluted continuities. So let's go ahead and get into my review and analysis of this series. Since this was technically the second story published in the in-universe timeline, it's hard not to compare it to Infiltration, its direct predecessor. And even though I like Verity, Hunter, and Jimmy, and the whole human angle, there's no denying that with humans and Earth out of the way, world building for the Transformers side of things got a greater focus here. From little technobabble details like magnotread or personal shield harmonics that I think Furman distributes fairly naturally through exposition, to the larger elements like Cybertron's downfall and the Exodus. There's just a satisfying emphasis on the Transformers here compared to Infiltration, and it's executed in a way that makes it seem like there's real depth to the world, like it's alive and lived in, and it's all presented in a pleasing blend of the horror and action genres, a mix that works well and shouldn't be that much of a surprise, seeing as how Furman established his skill at such exercises with the genre-hopping Matrix Quest storyline during the US Marvel Comics years. I see Stormbringer as the series that offered a more complete picture of what IDW had planned for their line of Transformers comics. Infiltration was IDW proving they could do the tried and true iteration of Transformers, that old chestnut where the Transformers are on Earth amongst humanity. Stormbringer is a reassurance that they wouldn't be going strictly for the low-hanging fruit, that they would be drawing from nearly every corner of the G1 toy line and mythos. Stormbringer doesn't do much to directly advance the story begun in Infiltration or answer a lot of the lingering questions. In fact, the plot thickens in regards to OR 13, where we learn that Bludgeon stumbled upon it while investigating a project called Regenesis. All of that will eventually pay off when we get to the first issue of the Spotlight series, but the mystery is effectively still intact at this point. The series does fill in some gaps in terms of lore, though, showing us what happened to Cybertron and why the Autobot-Decepticon war radiated outward to other planets. It fleshes out the universe Furman was building, providing some much-needed historical context for Cybertron and the war, and adding some depth and nuance to Cybertronian society beyond the simple divisions into Autobot and Decepticon factions, with the addition of an apocalyptic cult of weirdos led by Bludgeon. And all those little touches just make the world feel more alive and interesting to me. There's a theme running through Stormbringer about events being cyclical, history repeating itself, or echoes of past events persisting into the future. This theme presents itself in the book in some interesting ways. It's called out directly in the script with various mentions of things not being over or never ending, or like with Bludgeon saying that there are no endings, only cycles, and another example is on the very first page with the line, "Its calamitous echoes linger still." There's also an amusing literal echo as well, with Bludgeon saying in issue number 2 that Nose Cone and Afterburner, the Technobots he believed to have already perished, quote, got off lightly compared to the fate that would befall the other Technobots. Optimus Prime inadvertently throws this sentiment back in Bludgeon's gooey pretender face, saying the Decepticon got off lightly after being trapped in a prison of his own making. I just thought that was kind of a funny little touch, but beyond that, the theme also manifests itself structurally in a nifty little trick that Furman is fond of, and one that I heavily associate with Alan Moore, but a lot of other comics writers make use of it too, where the opening lines of an issue are repeated, typically at the close, usually recontextualized after reading the entire issue or with the addition of some new information. And this primarily occurs in issue number 2, where the narration about signs and portents, dark clouds, and unleashing a storm, all of this is from the first page, and then it's repeated word for word at the end with the small addition of, and now it seems others shall reap the whirlwind, tacked on for effect as Thunderwing ominously descends on Nebulos. This is employed in a subtle but clever way in issue number 4 as well, where the opening line, "This is how it ends," comes back around towards the end of the issue as Optimus Prime goes toe-to-toe with Thunderwing. But it's a little different how it's handled there. It's not so much a repetition of a cycle as breaking it. And that leads into what I think is the big picture of Stormbringer's theme, or the point of it all. Yes, events are cyclical and history inevitably repeats itself, but only if one doesn't make a conscious effort to end those cycles. And the well-worn aphorism, "Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it," seems appropriate here. Stormbringer is about breaking out of familiar doomed patterns, and Optimus Prime is the primary mover when it comes to this sentiment. He expressly talks about breaking the cycle in his speech to Thunderwing at the end, but he started changing the pattern before the final confrontation. And this is how I see it. The Autobots and Decepticons were so preoccupied with their war that they ignored the existential threat waiting in the wings until it was too late to do anything, and it cost them their homeworld. Optimus is haunted by this, reliving his failures over and over. So, when it seems like the destructive cycle might be starting again, Prime takes a much more proactive approach this time around, intent on addressing the problem as quickly as possible. When he calls in the Wreckers, he reminds Springer that Thunderwing's involvement is not confirmed, meaning he pulled the Wreckers out of a pivotal battle and most likely ceded the world of Vera Centralis to the Decepticons in the name of addressing the possibility of a bigger, more existential threat. I see that as Prime's past failures informing his present actions, a shifting of priorities to what he values as being more important. Another example of this theme in action is Prime's attitude towards nuking Cybertron. Most of the other players in this story, with the exception of Jetfire, are brutally pragmatic about stopping Thunderwing, even if it means completely destroying Cybertron. Optimus Prime is cagey and reticent about this idea. It was, after all, the line he drew in the sand in the flashback to Thunderwing's initial defeat, when Megatron was dead set on making sure the threat was ended once and for all, which produces an inner conflict where we don't know exactly where Prime's going to ultimately fall on this issue, and it all culminates in his last stand in issue number 4, where he's literally the only thing standing in the way of Cybertron's destruction. This refusal to accept the complete loss of Cybertron shows just how haunted Prime is by his past actions and how determined he is, through sheer force of will, to find a measure of atonement and break out of these patterns that will inevitably doom Cybertron. He says as much during the confrontation that this is how he breaks the cycle and begins to heal, vowing that this time there will be no retreat, no half measures. I will end the threat you pose to the universe or die trying. While it's somewhat of an amusingly mixed message for Optimus Prime's words of growth and healing, to be juxtaposed against images of him shooting every gun he has, it's subtle, and maybe I'm reading too much into this, but I think this story moves Furman's Prime into a fully formed, complete version of himself. Although still the capable Optimus Prime we all know and love, throughout this series Optimus is distracted and hesitant at times. And after this, in the Escalation and Devastation series, he seems much more decisive and focused to me, suggesting that he really did break the cycle and laid his ghosts to rest. Of course, you could also say that he created a new cycle during this series, one where his focus on the greater good created new blind spots. Here, that means putting the war aside and abandoning an entire planet to the mercy of his enemies, something that will most likely unintentionally, on the part of at least some of the creative teams, reoccur and ultimately bring major consequences in All Hail Megatron, and even reverberate through Phase 2 as well as Phase 3 in the pages of Optimus Prime. I think that's enough about the words, so let's talk about the pictures. Don Figueroa's artwork in Stormbringer is some of the best work he's done in Transformers comics. Hell, it's some of the best art ever done by any artist in Transformers comics. I'm partial to Transformers who look like they stepped out of a mecha manga or anime, and Figueroa is definitely in that pocket here. His characters just look cool. They're big and blocky and highly detailed, but the thing that makes them shine, I think, is Figueroa's technical skill in terms of proportions, posing, perspective, and how he frames and positions each character in his panels. Developing those skills is, I think, crucial to taking the work of any comics artist to the next level, and Figueroa's definitely got it down, and the storytelling in Stormbringer is so much stronger as a result. There are tons of interesting and dramatic angles that provide for continuous visual interest throughout the book. That, combined with Figueroa's detail-oriented approach, creates one of the most visually pleasing Transformers books that's ever been made, in my opinion. I mean, just look at this page of Thunderwing. I don't know about you, but I find this page to be absolutely stunning. It's gorgeous. The attention to detail in Stormbringer is just unreal. Not just in the characters themselves, but in their surroundings as well. Putting this much thought into the bridge and the diagnostic auditorium on Jetfire's ship, just for some isolated examples, makes for a more immersive experience and pulls its own weight in terms of world building right alongside the text. The spaces the characters inhabit feel carefully considered, and they're all executed for maximum effect. One downside to that, though, is that it's hard not to be a little disappointed that the completely demolished post-apocalyptic Cybertron is pretty much the only one we see. It makes total sense for the story, and it's really well done, but judging by how well Figueroa drew Nebulos, I would have loved to have seen more of his Cybertron pre-destruction. And that's not really a criticism, it's just me wanting more. I mean, look at this teaser image from the inner cover of the issues. Who wouldn't want to see more of this? Figueroa is obviously an accomplished artist with tons of technical ability behind him, and there's some really strong, really striking artwork throughout these pages. But I do have to admit a somewhat silly indulgence here, in that I think part of the fun of a Figueroa Transformers comic is the almost Where's Waldo quality of seeing what obscure character he's going to throw into the background of a scene. Now, a big part of that is due to Figueroa's talent for character design and redesign. It was really cool seeing what kind of Cybertronian modes he'd give characters back in War Within during the Dreamwave years, and it was just as exciting to see in Stormbringer, with the new designs for the Pretenders being a clear highlight. I know Bludgeon's Pretender armor is the more iconic look for that character, but I think it's too bad we didn't get more of this inner robot version throughout the IDW run, as I absolutely love this design. But really, I don't know if any of these characters have ever looked better than they do in Stormbringer, which is a testament to how well Don Figueroa renders them. And I've got to mention the colors as well. Josh Burcham is probably one of my favorite colorists in comics, and the quality he brings to Stormbringer is top-notch. His colors in this book are a lot more traditional than the work he would go on to do in the pages of More Than Meets the Eye and Optimus Prime, but it's no less beautiful and unique in its own right. Burcham usually gives interesting textures to his color work, and Stormbringer is no exception. Most of the colors in this book look as though they were done with a brush and watercolor paints. I know it was all done digitally, but I think that speaks to how well executed it is. And there's often a muted, understated quality to Burcham's colors that I'm a big fan of. Again, his work here is not as muted or faded as in More Than Meets the Eye, but that trait is certainly still apparent. The darker, subtle color palette enhances the overall atmosphere, a perfect companion to the claustrophobic and doom-laden vibe of the story. It also heightens the effect and impact of Figueroa's work by giving all those lines, panels, screens, and buttons a ton of eye-candy color. By the way, check this out. See how he subtly signed this page by throwing his name onto this monitor with the colors? It's one of those things I get a kick out of every time I read this book. There's a point in issue number 4 where Thunderwing is, I'm not sure what he's doing exactly, but he's unleashing some kind of explosive attack. And I love how these pages look. I mean, you want to talk about texture. Look at what Burcham is doing here. He's adding this effect. I'm not sure what to call it exactly, but it reminds me of television static or something. Whatever it is, it makes the whole thing look amazing. Little touches like those are definitely part of why I like Burcham's work so much. I feel like a lot of people just wouldn't have bothered or wouldn't even have thought to do that much in the first place. And as a complete package, the art feels very much like the team looked at their previous work with Dreamwave and said, once more with feeling. Even though this story and universe has nothing to do with Dreamwave's, you can still see the through line in terms of the creative team's development and growth in their craft. This is the Dreamwave style of Transformers comics at its zenith, in my opinion. Clearly, the line art and the colors are amazing, and there's plenty to look at in the panels themselves, but I do want to draw attention to some visual devices used throughout Stormbringer that I think are really nice. When cutting to the flashback sequences, the panels become less defined with shaky, rough borders. And this is a clever way of distinguishing between past and present. But the color work takes it a step further. The colors during these flashback sequences are washed out and faded, which creates a noticeable contrast from the much more vivid colors of the panels taking place in the present, making it that much more clear that we're switching between time periods. But that's not all. The gutters, or the empty spaces between the panels, are filled with color for the present day, whereas the gutters for the flashback scenes are the more traditional white commonly employed across the medium of comics. There are little transitions, too, where the color fades or drains out of the gutters when we go from a panel set in the present to one set in the past. This aligns with Figueroa's artwork in a pretty cool way in issue number 2, where we can see this method of delineating between past and present applied diagonally, with a front-on shot with Jetfire looking down and Thunderwing looking up in the top panel, followed by profile shots of Thunderwing looking left and down and Jetfire looking to the right and up. And the transition between past and present within those two panels is pretty cool as well, using shadow and word balloons to create a dividing line between past and present, which I guess means a shout out to Robbie Robbins, who did the letters, is in order. I definitely don't feel like I give enough credit to letterers when I analyze comics, or that it factors in nearly enough. Something to work on for sure, but it did stand out to me here. Anyway, the whole thing with panel borders, colors, text, all of it, this method of visually indicating the transition from present moment to memory is admittedly nothing mind-blowing, but it is a very nice little touch and a great attention to detail that makes excellent use of the language of comics to convey switching between time periods. Overall, I think Stormbringer is not reinventing the wheel in drastic fashion. It's just doing what it does exceptionally well. It's just a great Transformers story, one where the tone and vibe feels like a mixture of all the best parts of the best G1 Transformers fiction that came before it. And hey, Stormbringer might even be a good antidote for those that didn't like Infiltration or found the human characters insufferable. And I'd add that Stormbringer functions as a standalone story much more capably than Infiltration. Not to take anything away from Infiltration or to suggest that Stormbringer is perfectly self-contained or anything, but personally, there's a more satisfying sense of closure for me when I finish the final issue of Stormbringer compared to the final issue of Infiltration. It's a solid companion to the Earth-based, disguise-centric Infiltration series, bringing in the other half of what I think makes Transformers awesome, namely the weird and colorful space opera stuff. The 1984 cast will probably always be the grouping of characters that I hold in the highest regard. They're the ones that are the most iconic to me. I think the first season of the cartoon is the main reason why. While it certainly wasn't perfect, for a long time in my teenage, early adult years, it and the animated movie were my favorite and preferred G1 fiction, to the point that I put aside the stuff from the late 80s, coming to the conclusion that Transformers lost the plot after 1986. I still love that first season of the cartoon, but nowadays I like to see the less popular weirdos get their time in the limelight. Part of that is probably down to the fact that I've eased off on my whole putting on airs phase and since reconnected to the deep nostalgia I have for the toys from later on in the 80s. Even though the 84 cast was and probably still is my favorite, there's no denying that I just had more of the toys from 87 through 90 than I did from the earlier years of the brand, and I absolutely loved them. Plus, sometimes it's just more fun to see new, unexpected faces in Transformers stories rather than the same ones over and over again. So to see those more obscure characters appear in the pages of Stormbringer is a big part of why I love this book. Stormbringer is the complete package for me. A great script, jaw-dropping art, overall just exceptional storytelling in terms of the words and the pictures, and plenty of deep-cut references to the stranger, less visited corners of the Transformers universe. Anyway, that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching this episode on Stormbringer. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up, and I'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments. How do you like Stormbringer compared to Infiltration? What do you think of the concept and execution of Pretenders, whether in terms of the toys or the fiction? Yay or nay? A big shout out to everyone who's already subscribed to the channel. You all rock, and I appreciate you, and I'm very grateful. If you haven't subscribed, please do. It helps the channel and will make it easier for you to stay on top of future episodes of this retrospective. Stay tuned for part 4 and take care.